सबको मेरा सादर नमस्कार। मैं प्रणव कुमार प्रज्ञानम जेएनयू के मंच से आप सबका हार्दिक अभिनंदन एवं स्वागत करता हूं। आज के विमर्श का जो विषय रखा गया है वह विषय भारतीय राजनीति, एशिया की राजनीति और विश्व की राजनीति तीनों के लिए ही बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण विषय है। भारत चीन संबंध पर चर्चा के लिए आज हमारे मध्य श्रीमान नितिन गोखले जी हैं। श्रीमान नितिन गोखले जी is a world-renowned author and strategic analyst. We heartily welcome him and thank him for accepting our invitation. Most welcome, sir.
Thank you. नमस्कार, धन्यवाद।
आगे बढ़ने से पहले मैं आज के कार्यक्रम की रूपरेखा संक्षिप्त में प्रस्तुत करना चाहता हूं। सर्वप्रथम हमारे अग्रज डॉक्टर रणविजय सिंह जी, जो जवाहरलाल नेहरू विश्वविद्यालय के SIS में अंतर्राष्ट्रीय राजनीति के प्रोफेसर हैं, इस विषय पर प्रास्ताविक उद्बोधन देंगे एवं हमारे मुख्य वक्ता का स्वागत भी करेंगे। मैं डॉक्टर रणविजय सिंह जी का आभार व्यक्त करता हूं कि वो आज हमारे साथ जुड़े। नमस्कार। तत्पश्चात हमारे मुख्य वक्ता नितिन गोखले जी का भाषण होगा, लगभग 40 मिनट का होगा। उसके अगले चरण में प्रश्न उत्तर होगा जो लगभग 15 मिनट का होगा। अंतिम चरण में समापन टिप्पणी एवं धन्यवाद देने के लिए डॉक्टर अभिषेक श्रीवास्तव जी हैं। डॉक्टर अभिषेक श्रीवास्तव जी SIS में असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर हैं एवं अखबारों में लेखन के लिए भी जाने जाते हैं। मैं उनका भी हार्दिक अभिनंदन करता हूं। नमस्कार। बिफोर मूविंग फॉरवर्ड, I request you to kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel and encourage us in our endeavors. Now, I request Dr. Ranvijay Singh ji to give his opening remarks and welcome Sriman Nitin ji. Dr. Ranvijay Singh ji.
Thank you, Pranav. Namaskar to all of you, and I welcome Nitin Gokhale ji at Pragyanam to deliver a lecture on very earnest topic, India-China relations, past tense, future uncertain. Nitin Gokhale ji, author of more than a dozen of books on military history, insurgencies, and wars, is a leading strategic analyst. He is by training a media entrepreneur, a specialist in conflict coverage. Gokhale ji has lived and reported from India's northeast for 23 years. He has covered the ground report at Kargil in summer 1999. Gokhale ji writes lectures and analyses security and strategic matters in Indo-Pacific. He is also a popular visiting faculty at India's Defense Services Staff College. So his vast knowledge on the subject, today's lecture would enrich our knowledge and would impart a fresh idea on the subject. China and India are two major regional powers in Asia and are the two most populous countries and among the fastest growing major economy in the world. Growth in diplomatic and economic influence has increased the significance of their bilateral relationship. Both of the nations are competing to dominate in the region and beyond it. As we all know, India and China has been having border disputes and had fought a war in 1962. Also, the recent skirmishes in Doklam and in Galwan has reminded that territorial disputes is a still deciding factor between India and China relations. So in this context, India and China is contesting in Asian region as well as the relationship of these countries is influencing the structure of international politics. So India-China relations not only influences the real politics of this region, but it go beyond that. Both nations are competing each other at global level to play a greater role in international politics. In this context, this lecture becomes very important. Sir, I welcome you to kindly deliver your lecture. Please, sir.
Dhanyavad, Ranvijay Singh ji. Thank you very much, everyone who's joined this virtual lecture. First of all, thanks to Gopal Pariyar for persuading me to come and join this very important forum, Pragyanam in JNU. This is something that I feel honored and privileged that all of you have given me this opportunity, and especially the organizers, to share my thoughts. I'm no China expert. There are far better informed and better learned people on China. All that I do is basically cull their knowledge into a capsule that can be shared in 40 minutes. That's why I always say that I like to share my thoughts rather than lecture people, because these thoughts can be at variance with many other thoughts that people may have. And it is not necessary for all of you to accept my thoughts or my statements as the last word on China. China is a very complex country, and India-China relations are more complicated than any other relationship that India has with any other country. So even with Pakistan, the relationship is straightforward, black and white. With China, it cannot be said it's black and white. It has got shades of gray. It's got many other nuances which come to play. And not now, but since 1949, when China became the People's Republic of China, and India was already an independent nation for nearly 2 years when China became the People's Republic of China. It has been a relationship that has been has seen ups and downs, mostly downs, very few ups in these years since 1949. We are going to complete 60 years of the 1962 war or skirmish, conflict, whatever you want to call it, in October this year. 20th October 1962 was the day when China launched a sudden attack in Ladakh, as well as in what was then Northeast Frontier Agency, or now Arunachal Pradesh, across the Bumla salients coming down to Tawang in a jiffy from Thagla and the other areas around the line of actual control, or what is called the McMahon line in Arunachal Pradesh. So it's not an easy relationship, and it's not easy to manage either. Currently we are passing through one of the worst standoffs, one of the worst phases of India-China relationship. This has come after, I would say, nearly 15 years of relative peace and contrived management of the border. Boundary issue is the most dominant and overwhelming factor between India and China since 1959, followed by the war in 1962. So the past has been tense. The future looks certainly uncertain. There is no denying the fact that we have not yet out of the crisis that erupted in May 2020 and is still continuing. In fact, on 11th of February 2021, the first disengagement at Pangang So, North Bank of Pangang So, and the Kailash Range operations. I don't need to elaborate on these places because by now the world and mostly Indians interested in India-China relations know these places. This happened, in fact, today being the 15th of February, was the time when I had the opportunity to interview the then Northern Army Commander, Lieutenant General Y.K. Joshi, in Leh, exactly 1 year ago. And we published his interview on 17th of February, which is where there was a lot of optimism exactly 1 year ago. But since then, things have moved very slowly. We are not yet in the phase where you can say that we have completed the disengagement on the LAC in Ladakh. There are still some points, friction points as we call them, are remaining. But my purpose of sharing these thoughts is not to talk about the current issues, but look at the past a little bit and derive some lessons for the future of India-China relationship. So let's look at what happened in the past. Why did 1962 take place? I think from 1954 onwards, the signs of the Chinese behavior or aggressive Chinese behavior and Chinese contempt for India were evident when we did that Panchsheel agreement, India and China, under the watchful eyes of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who had a very rosy-eyed, romantic view of China because he thought that China and India, being two ancient civilizations, both being Asian powers, can take on the world, the Western world, and have a compact, an agreement that can take care of Asia's future. And so he was the leading proponent of the Afro-Asia conference, all of you will remember, in 1953, which took place in Bandung in Indonesia, where Chow Enlai, China's premier, was also invited. Nehru was the leading light of that conference. In fact, India lent an Air India plane to Chow Enlai to ferry him from Beijing, what is to be called Peking that time, to Indonesia. But that plane, actually, Chow Enlai didn't board. If all of you have read my book on R.N. Kao, the founder of RNAW, the Research and Analysis Wing, it has this full 2 chapters on what happened to Kashmir Princess, the plane that belonged to Air India. Chow Enlai got a hint that there is going to be sabotage, and he didn't board the plane. That plane was blown up over the Indonesian Sea. And then he came in a separate plane. So that time, Jawaharlal Nehru thought China is going to be India's friend. But China never had that intention. They only wanted to use the years of rebuilding their nation to keep India at bay. But they always had hostile designs on India, as it became evident in 1958-59. 1954 Panchsheel Agreement or the Indo-Tibet agreement was signed. I mean, on Tibet, the agreement was signed. China had walked into Tibet in 1959 when Dalai Lama had to flee from that country. And by 1957-58, India had already discovered, to its horror, that China had built the Tibet Highway, Tibet-Xinjiang Highway through Aksai Chin, what is now called the G219 on the map. That highway was being built without India's knowledge. India did not have the wherewithal, did not have the capacity or intelligence to understand what was happening in that remote area. And when it got discovered, India was in a shock because it was clearly India's territory, Aksai Chin, which China had not only occupied, but had also built infrastructure through that Aksai Chin area. So since 1957, 58 and 59 onwards, the relationship went south. It started deteriorating. And then the Chinese said that, these are historic aberrations. The British had duped us. We had not agreed to the McMahon line, and our maps don't show what the British showed. So you must accept what we say. And India by then was not willing to accept, and Nehru, and if you have to read some new books on China-India relationship, then you must read former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao's book called The Fractured Himalaya. That gives you the entire historic background of how the India-China relations evolved in the decade of the 50s and the 60s. If you want to understand how the Chinese prepare their negotiating position, you must read former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale's 2 books, one on Tiananmen Square and one called The Long Game, which he wrote about the Chinese negotiating tactics and what India must do. And there are, of course, other books. There is one more book called The Long Game by Rush Doshi. He's a Stanford scholar now in the US National Security Council as a member. The relationship went south, as I said. Then we had that 1 month long military conflict in the high Himalayas. And that military conflict actually scarred the nation. It was a psychological shock, not just to Jawaharlal Nehru, who died soon after, within a year and a half of that humiliating defeat. It was military, diplomatic, and political defeat for Jawaharlal Nehru's model of what he called Pan-Asian unity, and his status in the world as an elder statesman or a statesman of repute was in tatters. And history proves, or literature from that time proves, that Mao Zedong, who was the supreme leader of the Communist Party of China, wanted actually to humiliate Nehru, because he saw Nehru as somebody who was an upstart, who thought the world should listen to India's ways of non-violence and peaceful liberation from the British as the only way. And the Chinese did not believe in that. They never believe in that. In fact, the Chinese think of themselves as very superior race. Their whole worldview, even today, in fact, because that worldview exists even today, we are seeing what we are seeing today. The worldview is that we are the middle kingdom, we are at the top of the hierarchy, and all other countries around us and elsewhere must pay tribute to China. That China is the supreme power, superior power. Every other country, every other nation must bow down to China. That's their hierarchical view of the world. They don't believe in rules-based order. They don't believe in unity of purpose or United Nations or otherwise. Their view is derived from their old mentality of what they call the middle kingdom. That means they're middle of the universe. They're the center of the universe. Everybody else has to revolve around them like satellites, is what their worldview has been. And this has been consistent worldview. We have forgotten what the Chinese and the scholars, even in India, are fond of quoting Sun Tzu, as all of you are aware, forgetting that around the same time or even before, Kautilya, who wrote Arthashastra, actually spoke of many of these things about statecraft, about military, about how to deal with your neighbor. And in fact, Kautilya called the next door neighbor as your greatest enemy, and the neighbor of the next door neighbor as your friend, because enemy's enemy is friend, which India did not believe in that at that point of time. We have forgotten this statecraft. So anyway, coming back to the 60s, after the humiliating defeat in the 1962 war, India was on the back foot. India carried that scar for at least 5 years. Of course, there was that big skirmish in Nathula in 1967, where the Chinese were given a bloody nose. 400 of the Chinese soldiers were killed in Nathula by just about 80, 90 Indian soldiers. That was a befitting reply. And yet the diplomatic relationship remained on the back burner. We did not have a representative until 1976. And it was only in 1988 that a breakthrough came in the form of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to Beijing. And in fact, in my forthcoming book on a dozen operations by RNAW, which should come very soon, one of the highlights of that book is how RNAW or RAW prepared for the breakthrough with China in 1988, when Rajiv Gandhi went to meet Deng Xiaoping, who was the second supreme leader after Mao died. And again, that breakthrough or that visit was started by Aran Kao, who was by then the security advisor to Mrs. Gandhi, Indira Gandhi. And he was in Beijing when Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated on 31st October 1984. So that phase from 1962 to 1984-85 was the coldest and the most hostile phase of India-China relationship. We did not talk to each other. We did not have too much representation in each other's countries. All that happened. 88 opened the floodgates. We started talking to the Chinese. The Chinese also were changing. There was a churn in China. All of you are aware of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which also created a lot of internal churn in China. There was a leadership change. And then the Chinese opened up their economy. So they were busy trying to become an economic power or a powerhouse. And therefore, they wanted peace on the border with India. So they proposed a number of agreements. So it started with the 1993 Peace and Tranquility Agreement. Then it came to 1996, where the further agreement was done. And then 2003, there were the political parameters about negotiating with each other. So the Chinese bought time from India, and the Indian decision makers, political leaders fell for it. The Chinese wanted then to concentrate on their economic progress, development. So they came up with this idea that we will manage the line of actual control, the boundary. We will retain or maintain peace and tranquility on the boundary. There will be protocols in place which will make sure that no incident goes out of hand. It does not escalate. That happened. Despite all that, there were, of course, tensions. Once in a while, the Chinese would assert that this is their area. This is where they have the claim, historic claim over certain areas like Galwan, or they call entire Arunachal as South Tibet. So all those are well known to you. So that phase from 88 to nearly 2006, 2007 continued to be like that. But from 2006, 2007 onwards, the Chinese started reasserting themselves, because by then they had become 4 times or 5 times India's economy. They had built their military, they had modernized their army and the navy or the air force. And they had become a power to reckon with. They were now the factory of the world. They were ready to take on the United States. So the turning point in China's history and their belligerence, their aggressiveness against India came in 2008. That is when the financial crisis hit the world and the American economy collapsed. America was no longer leading the world in that sense of setting the agenda for economy. Almost every other country in the world except China faced the problem of recession and low economic activity because of the collapse of the Wall Street, the stock market, and the collapse of the economy. But the Chinese by then had become so rich, they had so much money, that they started asserting themselves, and they realized that America can be attacked, America is vulnerable. And that is where the Chinese rise began. It rose higher than India because the Indian economy was also doing well, but it wasn't doing as well as the Chinese in that period. And from then on, the Chinese aim or objective was to compete with US. So by 2005, 2006, and then by 2008, definitely they took their eyes off India. They said India is insignificant, India is a small player, we need not bother, and whatever we do, they will have to accept. And we had a government that time which did not bother to look into all these issues. We allowed the Chinese a free run of our markets. Many of you may not remember or may not know that while the security apparatus in India was conscious of the China challenge, it was ready to do what it wanted to do, the security and the military and the strategic establishment was willing to look at China more seriously. The most damage to India's interest and India's economy was done by the Commerce Ministry under Anand Sharma. One of the biggest culprits of today's situation that we find ourselves in terms of market, I mean, the trade deficit with China, is the Commerce Minister of the UPA 1 and 2, or maybe just UPA 2. I'm not very clear about his tenure as Commerce Minister. He opened everything for the Chinese, from toys to umbrellas to Ganesh Murtis to candles to medicines, everything. No tariffs, no control, no customs duty, nothing. So the Chinese flooded their cheap goods into the Indian market, and of course, consumers love inexpensive alternative if they get one. And in the process, the Chinese and the government's policies of that time killed many of India's MSMEs and small traders and small trades and small businesses, because the Chinese flooded the market. This is one of the most insidious chapters of India's history, recent history with China. We don't realize it so much because we only try to focus on the security aspects of the India-China relationship. But the Chinese very cleverly captured the market, very cleverly dominated the market, and then made Indian traders, Indian manufacturers dependent on their raw material. So today, if we see $25 billion deficit with China, it has not happened overnight. It is not because the Indian manufacturers don't want an alternative, because they have no alternative. They have been left with nothing because the Chinese have cheap manufacturing facilities. Their API for pharmaceutical companies, they are a dominant market. And India, instead of becoming a manufacturing hub during that period, the first 15 years of this century, from 2000 to 2014-15, India concentrated only on being traders, or Indian businesses only became traders. They imported cheap goods from China and sold it at a higher price to the Indian consumer, without realizing that in the process, they have killed what was our strength. MSMEs, manufacturing units, all that just vanished. So that was the period from 2000 to 2015. And then the Chinese became more and more confident of taking on India. They realized that in India, the governments are weak. They can be influenced, they can be bought by various means, and they need not necessarily buy governments or government decision makers through just bribes. You just offer incentives in terms of access or in terms of cheaper goods. That is how you sort of influence what I call elite buying by the Chinese. They have preferred this model the world over, that you buy or you influence or you co-opt many of the elites. And the elites are think tankers, intellectuals, professors, lawyers, doctors, and traders and business leaders, and then finally political and bureaucratic leaders. You just influence them, you co-opt them, you give them a rosy picture about how our two civilizations can work together, how trade can flourish. Our trade can go from $20 billion, bilateral trade from 20 to $100 billion in no time, without realizing that it was the Chinese who were getting all the advantage. And not the Indian trader or Indian manufacturing, manufacturing system. So this is what happened. So come 2013, the Chinese started showing their real intention on the boundary. The first intrusions into Depsang in this past 10 years came in April 2013, when the Chinese intruded 21 kilometers into the Indian territory and parked themselves in that place for 21 days. So instead of giving them a face-off or putting same number of troops in their face, Indian government that time, the fag end of the UPA 2, said that we will discuss the issue diplomatically and politically. Famously or infamously, Salman Khurshid, who was then the External Affairs Minister, said that this is a pimple on our cheek and we need not worry too much about it. We will take care of this. That again emboldened the Chinese, and they had already judged, excuse me one minute. They had already judged that Indian system is weak, Indian political decision making is slow, because from 1989 to 2014, they had got used to coalition governments in Delhi. Coalition governments have to have perforce, by compulsion, compromise. There are levers within coalition governments which can be used to get favorable decisions. So they knew exactly where to get what. And they never thought that in 2014, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the NDA would come with a single largest majority or a full majority. So they were shocked a little bit, but they said, let's deal with Narendra Modi. So they tried to woo him initially. They invited him, even Prime Minister Modi invited Xi Jinping to India, as you are aware, in September 2014. He came, he went to Ahmedabad first and then came to Delhi. As he went to Ahmedabad, the Chinese were testing the resolve of this government. They sent 1,000 troops, PLA troops, into a place called Chumur, or Chumar as it is popularly known, in southeast Ladakh, near Demchok. And they thought India will respond in the usual manner, like it had done in 2013 or even before. When Chinese intruded, they would sue for peace, or they would say, okay, let's talk diplomatically, let's not give a face-off, let's not have the two troops facing each other. But here was a different government. It had a strong parliamentary majority. It had a leader who was willing to take chances and who was willing to speak in plain language to the other side. So in Ahmedabad, as they sat on that swing, all of you will remember that famous photograph on the banks of the Sabarmati. Prime Minister Modi told Xi Jinping that this is not acceptable, the intrusion by your troops. And if you don't order them back, we will be forced to take action as we deem fit on the border itself. So overnight, India built 3,000 troops against 1,000 Chinese troops in Chumur. This had never happened. The Chinese had never faced this situation in the previous 15 years. And they were shocked. So within about 7 days or 6 days, that crisis got resolved. And Xi Jinping realized that this man is a different cup of tea. He is a different, of different metal. And therefore, from then on, the Chinese decided to make sure that even up to 2015, they were still okay. When Prime Minister Modi went to China, they laid out a red carpet, but they did not give concessions. Prime Minister Modi, in fact, made a statement that let's clarify the line of actual control, because unless you know where the line of actual control is and which is your jurisdiction and my jurisdiction, we cannot settle the boundary. The Chinese never responded to that because they have no intention to respond to that kind of a situation or that kind of a proposition. So 2016 onwards, the relations went south again. 2017, Dolam happened. See, one of the things that the Chinese are very strong in is narrative setting. And I want to give you just a very small example. Most of us in this gathering here, the virtual gathering, would call the 2017 crisis as Doklam crisis. It is actually not Doklam. The area where the crisis happened, it's called Dolam in the Sikkimese language, in Bhutanese language, and Indian troops call it Dolam. But because the Chinese call it Doklam, and they call it Donglang actually, and it became Doklam, from Donglang it became Doklam, we all use that casually as Doklam. Actually, we have become very casual about this, and we say it's Doklam crisis. But I urge all of you, if you want to really, push back against the Chinese and not defeat them, you must start calling it the Dolam crisis or the Dolam area between India, China, and Bhutan, that tri-junction in the Chumbi Valley. That's the first step one must take to push back against Chinese narrative. China is a a past master in setting narratives, propaganda, lies, deceit. So if you revisit the Dolam crisis of 2017, they started threatening India, saying, you will face the repeat of 1962, you will get a humiliating defeat to your military. All that propaganda started. Fortunately, again, India stood firm, Indian leadership, Indian military stood firm, and they had to back down after 73 days. In fact, I'll quote the Chinese ambassador, then Chinese ambassador who was here in Delhi. 3 months after that crisis was resolved in August 2017, 27th August 2017, in fact. One of the reasons why it got resolved was there was to be a BRICS summit in China, and China wanted India to be there. So that was one contributing factor. But that apart, when we were at a social gathering 3 months after that resolution, the Chinese ambassador, surprisingly in a candid mood, confessed to 3-4 of us who were standing around him that I asked him, what is your takeaway from that crisis? So he said, one of the biggest takeaways, and perhaps the biggest takeaway from there, is that we expected Bhutan to protest diplomatically, but did not expect an Indian military intervention in that area. Because remember, where that standoff took place for 73 days was actually Bhutanese territory. It's a disputed territory, or China says it's a disputed territory between Bhutan and China. India actually has no claim on that territory where this happened. But Indian troops actually went across into Bhutan, even if it's 500 meters or 600 meters, and stood firm against China, and then forced them to back down. Now the Chinese were again shocked. They thought this has never happened, but that is where they started plotting for the future. They built their own troops on their side of Dolam in the Chumbi Valley, in Farizong and Dizong, as they have it there, that side. And as things panned out, came the 2019 elections. Now, they were shocked with the 2014 elections, but they thought it was a one-time phenomenon of majority government coming to power in India. They were hoping that because of all the political crisis and the contrived controversy over Rafale and demonetization and others, Prime Minister Modi will not win a second term, or will not win a decisive second term. But 2019, they were shocked further, because not only did the BJP and the NDA win, they came back with a larger majority. And that's when the Chinese leadership decided that time is running out. If they have to humiliate Prime Minister Modi and his team, if they have to bring them down couple of notches like they did to Nehru in 1962, they must do something immediately. COVID came in December 2019, and by January or February of 2020, when normally the Chinese troops start moving towards Aksai Chin for their annual exercises in March and April, they decided that this is the time to show its real teeth or real aggression against India by doing multiple incursions, or trying to get into Ladakh, trying to get into areas which were vulnerable or which were lightly held. And they thought this will force Modi to take a decision which will then start off a skirmish or a clash or a conflict. And then they can humiliate him with the military defeat, which they thought will be easy. Again, they miscalculated. They miscalculated India's response, which was swift, which was decisive, and which was resolute. And therefore, the mirror deployment by Indian forces in Ladakh of 60,000 troops built in 10 days or 15 days of May 2020, again sent Chinese calculations haywire. They did not expect this to happen. Clearly, because the Chinese were fixated on the US as their main rival, they had not kept track of developments in India. The military leadership had already taken cognizance of the Chinese challenge. They had already worked out how the logistics will work, how troops can be deployed at a short notice. And more than anything else, they had miscalculated the political will of the Modi government and Prime Minister Modi. So while you may have a large army with you and a large air force with you, but if you don't have the will to use the large army or the large forces that you have, then there is no point having those. So again, May 2020 surprised the Chinese. So Galwan was one attempt to humiliate India, to try and again create fissures within and do something that could send India back like the 1962 war. That did not succeed. And that is where we are. The Chinese wanted to win without fighting. They did not go. Remember one thing, I just want to say two final things before I stop, that to win in the mountains, you need the ratio of defender against the aggressor. China is the aggressor here and India is the defender. The aggressor needs 7 times the force of the defender. So if India had 60,000 troops defending the line of actual control, the Chinese needed to bring in nearly 5 lakh troops or 4,20,000 troops to overwhelm or to defeat the Indian forces decisively. Mountain warfare demands 7 to 9 times the troops of the defender for the aggressor. China did not bring those number of troops. All that they wanted was to coerce India, to bully India by showing, doing a show of strength on the border. But they did not succeed there because India had already seen through their game. They did not want to fight. If they really wanted to fight, they would have brought in 5 lakh troops to overwhelm India like they did in 1962. Today's generation of the Chinese military leadership wants to win without fighting, through standoff weapons, through cyber war, through missiles, through weapons which can be fired from a distance. They don't want a physical fight. They're afraid of that. So therefore, this did not happen. And now we are at a stage where, having shown the Chinese their place, they have made one of the biggest mistakes Xi Jinping has made, is that to gain some tactical advantage and to try and humiliate the Modi government, they have lost India strategically. Today, all of us are aware of the China challenge. All of us are discussing the Chinese as the main threat. We don't even bother about, at least I don't bother about Pakistan. I never bothered about Pakistan. Pakistan is like a monkey on our back. We can always deal with it. It's a very small, insignificant country as far as we are concerned. We should treat it like that. We should look at the China challenge as the bigger challenge. If we can take care of the China challenge in the future, and it's going to be complicated, the boundary issue is not going to be settled. We are not decoupling very quickly as far as trade is concerned, because we've become dependent on the Chinese. It's like a drug addict. Our trade and businesses have become like drug addicts who cannot do without the China fix to get their raw material, cheap raw material. And therefore, it's going to be a long time, at least 5 years, before we can actually move away from China as far as raw material and other supplies are concerned. But we have started doing that. We not only banned apps, we have prevented companies like Huawei and others to come into the Indian telecom sector. We are taking steps to secure our cyber frontier, as we call it. And multiple things are done. Indian military is now planning for taking on the Chinese if it comes to an all-out conflict, which I don't think will happen. But if it comes to it, Indian military will be prepared. And my sense is, by doing what the Chinese did in 2020 in Ladakh, they have actually speeded up our preparations of infrastructure, military preparation and military hardware that we would have otherwise done in 5 or 6 years. If you take 2020 as the starting point, what we would have done by 2026 or 2027, we were forced to do it. India as a nation were forced to do it in 2 years. So the loss is of the Chinese. They have lost India's confidence. India is no longer going to trust them in anything. They have lost the advantage of the surprise. They have forced us to modernize and become stronger in 2 years time frame rather than 6 years time frame. Our infrastructure is improved along the border. We have become more confident of being allies or partners with Western countries like United States, Japan, I mean, the Quad countries. We are more open to do our alliance with these countries. Earlier, we were hesitant, but no longer. So the Chinese have actually lost much more than the Indians have in that sense. So I'm going to stop here. What is the future? I have said future uncertain. It certainly looks uncertain, but who knows what happens. But we are a confident nation. We are much more confident than we were in 2020. This has been a wake-up call, and I call it the Pakistan challenge is the subset of the China challenge. If you can take care of the China challenge, we can take care of Pakistan also. So please, as academics, as researchers, as scholars, please concentrate more on China rather than Pakistan. Study it, study its language, study its culture, study its policies, and we will be better off with that. I think I'm going to stop here. I have already actually exceeded my time. I had said 40 minutes. I've done 50 minutes here, perhaps. But China is so vast that the subject can never end. Actually, you can go on for a day. But I'm going to stop here and give the floor to the next speaker and some questions or criticism or some comments that you may have. I'm happy to answer them or sort of respond to them. Thank you very much for this time and this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. I think that you rightly said earlier that you will give in a capsule form. It was really a capsule that succinctly summarized everything that we wish to know. Now, for question answer, I request all the participants who wish to ask, keep your question short and direct. So first, I request Rahul Rawat ji to ask his question.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for this insightful talk. Sir, actually, what I can understand from your even recent interview with General Raj Shukla, that there are so many things in the pipeline. But sir, my question is more about the, how does China negotiate? So basically, we have seen this 62, then 67, 75, 87, 2013, and now 2020. So, so what is like your key takeaways from these kind of incidents, and how does China negotiate by bringing us, the insights from ground zero? And especially in this 2020 incident, we have seen a series of negotiations. So what are like your key takeaways when it comes to understand Chinese, and how does China negotiate? Basically the Chinese military. Thank you.
Rahul, my short answer would be that you please read my friend Vijay Gokhale's book on how the Chinese negotiate. But I will not end it there. All that I'll say is the Chinese are careful negotiators. They have long memories. Their institutional memory and their institutional record keeping is far better than us. We need to learn from them. They will quote you something from, say, 1969, suddenly if you go to negotiate with them, because they have kept meticulous records, because they have a uniformity of thought and uniformity of approach, which unfortunately in a democracy does not happen, cannot happen. But we must have institutional memory. And I'm glad that for the first time in India's history, the military leadership is leading the negotiations, because nobody better than the military leaders on the ground to understand what the reality is, what the ground situation is. So that's a good change from the earlier times. And therefore, I would think we are getting there. In fact, I do a small part of the capsule that we do together called Negotiating with China. We do it for the military leaders and for diplomats. So we've done 2 of them, in fact, in the past 3 months, me and Vijay Gokhale and a couple of others. And all that I would say is that Chinese are clever negotiators. They're long-term and long game people. So we must also learn to be patient, which was demonstrated. In fact, we demonstrated that during these 14 rounds of talks. We did not lose patience. We did not lose our, what I call, we did not let our anger or our I would say, anger against the Chinese come in the way of negotiating. So therefore, we are also learning, and I think that's the way to deal with them. If they have a patient approach, we should also have a patient approach. I think that's what the trick is, really.
Now I request Rahul Srivastav ji.
Good evening, Professor. Amazing insights. Sir, since you gave these really, close things from the ambassador, I'd like to know your take on whether a growing China-Russia relationship can be a cause of concern for India in a very short way. Thank you, Professor.
It is, well, Rahul, thank you for giving me that title. I'm not a professor. I'm just a normal hack. I've just been all my life I've been a journalist, so I don't have any academic credentials to call myself professor. But nevertheless, your question is extremely useful and valid, that the China-Russia nexus or China-Russia alliance or closeness is a cause of worry for us. And I think India is playing the cards well. We are keeping the Russians humored. And one advantage that we have, or one opening that we have, is the Russians also do not want to get too close to the Chinese, because they know the Chinese will overwhelm them or just dominate them. So the Russians are also looking for these kind of opportunities which India is giving them. So therefore, if you see how Russians also come to us, Putin came during this pandemic only. He went out until then. When he came to India, he had not gone out anywhere. He first came to India and now has gone to Beijing. So Russia also knows that while they are dependent on China at the moment and are an inferior power to China, they do not want to give China the leeway in Central Asia, their spheres of influence, basically. And that's where India should play its cards well. It is playing its cards well and keeping the Russians on our side to woo the Chinese away from Russia, Russia away from China. And maybe India is playing a behind-the-scenes role in resolving the crisis in Ukraine between Russia and the US. We do not know. So that's where India is now becoming smarter. We are multi-aligned rather than non-aligned. That's the change in the foreign policy.
Thank you, sir. Now I request Dr. Arun Tripathi ji.
Good evening, sir. Such a pleasure to listen to you. I'm looking, first of all, I'm looking forward to your new book, which is going to come. You mentioned about that because your earlier book regarding Ra of Taj Spy Master was very interesting. And some of the unsung heroes were mentioned in that book, like Nath Babu, P.N. Banerjee. So it was a pleasure to read that. So I'm looking forward to that book, sir. My first question is that regarding the Sai-War or narrative setting, which you mentioned, that how, we all talk about Doklam and not Dolam. So how with the well-controlled media, particularly social media, I mean, it is non-existent maybe in China, I don't know about that. So how with the well-controlled media by Chinese, we have some unequal footing to counter Sai-War, being a democracy. So what would be some proper steps to counter, such narrative settings, which is being built up by our, counter partners? My another acquisition is also about, the recent development which is happening between Russia and Ukraine. So why you see that? I mean, you mentioned that 60,000 border troops have built up between India and China only at Ladakh, and around 80 to 90,000 between, Russia and Ukraine. So, though the China has put a similar threat to India, how, India is unable to get the world's attention, especially the West, in terms of, the challenge it is facing. But Russia has, managed to get better attention in that case, sir. So I want your observation on that, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Arun Tripathi. I'll answer your second question first. The geographical setting and the geopolitical setting of Ukraine-Russia tension, or let me call it Russia-West or NATO tension, has to be taken into account before we think of why they are getting the attention. Remember, it is the Americans which are provoking the Russians into taking action the action that they're taking. After all, Ukraine was part of USSR or Soviet Union. Let's not forget. It's like saying that the Chinese will station troops next to the Siliguri corridor in Bangladesh, and then expecting India not to react. What exactly the NATO countries and the Americans are doing is to provoke Russia into doing what they're doing. I'm not saying there's going to be war. Both do not want war, and this is posturing to my mind. But the attention is because the West is dominating the narrative building, and it is getting that attention. India will never get India-China border standoff, or the kind of large mobilization of troops will never get that attention, because India is also aware, and I always keep telling students of international relations that please remember the Quad countries, for instance, are doing well about the coalition that they have, and what they're trying to do. But nobody from those Quad countries also have long contested border with China, land border. It's only India that has to deal with it. And that's the reality. They are on our doorstep. So India will have to take action as they deem fit bilaterally against China, and do not expect US or Japan or Australia to come to your aid. It will never come to our aid. That's the reality, and we must face up to it and prepare accordingly and deal with it accordingly. So that's my answer to your second question. The first question, again, very relevant. Narrative setting need not be for the Chinese population. First, we have to do narrative setting for the rest of the world. Show Chinese as the aggressors, China as the betrayer of, like Jaishankar, I think the EAM said yesterday in Australia, that it is the Chinese who have violated the written agreements and not India. The crisis was started by the Chinese. So let's set that narrative. And then there are vulnerabilities that the Chinese have, but we must have more people studying China, as I mentioned. I call it the 3 T's vulnerability. T is the alphabet in the English language. And what are the 3 T's vulnerabilities? It is Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen. The moment you start speaking about these 3 issues, the Chinese are on the back foot. So remember, whenever we do narrative setting, whenever we write about it, always bring in these 3 issues in whichever way you can, or in your conversations or in your writings. The Chinese will get rattled about it. They don't like, they do not have the ability to absorb criticism or unfair comparison. I don't know how many of you are aware, in 2020, Strat News Global, our website, and me were threatened by the Chinese embassy for doing a video called Shitler. I compared the rise of rise of Xi Jinping to rise of Hitler politically by giving factual milestones in their journey to the top. And it's a 7-minute video. It's got more than 6 lakh views, which is nothing compared to what you get for entertainment videos and Shadika videos and all that. But still, I got threatened by the Chinese embassy because they felt vulnerable. They felt humiliated. So there are ways of doing it against the Chinese as far as narrative setting is concerned. But it needs sustained effort. It needs coordinated effort, which I think we are getting there, but getting there slowly.
Thank you, sir. I think we'll take one more question, and
yes,
if you permit, then I will ask it.
Please do.
You have mentioned about elite buying by the Chinese, and we have read many things in newspapers about this phenomena occurring in United States of America too. Now, we know that there are a number of left parties and left NGOs and left-leaning intellectuals and academics in India, and actually they dominate. And this is also related to the agenda setting and narrative setting. Now I just want your take that, do you think that they pose a threat to India's national security in terms of India's interest vis-a-vis China?
Oh, indeed they do. Again, I'll attract. I mean, see, as I said, I'm no expert. I am only an aggregator of views in a way. I draw your attention to what National Security Advisor Ajit Doval said at the passing out parade of the Indian Police Academy in Hyderabad just about 3-4 months ago, where he said civil society is the next frontier of war. Today there will be no physical war, or they are very expensive. He didn't say there will be no physical war. He said those wars are expensive. If you can win by weakening you internally or through narrative setting and through fake news and all kinds of deception and misinformation and disinformation, then you won half the battle or divide the society. So that danger is the current, the present and clear and present danger, as they call it. There is that movie called Clear and Present Danger. The clear and present danger is the subversion of Indian civil society. And the Chinese do it very subtly. They do it through the Pakistanis, they do it through the West, they do it through the left parties, they do it through NGOs, they do it through the very bastion where you're sitting from the campus that all of you belong to, perhaps. But again, that is changing. I hope all of you are a part of that change. You are leading that change. And so therefore, we have to be just vigilant and make sure that we counter it with facts, we counter it with dexterity and skill. And I'm just one small part of that counter narrative setting, very, very tiny speck in that bigger firmament. There are enough bigger people with bigger, larger influence, but one tries and does one's bit and contribute. And this is one of the sessions that I hope I have contributed to understanding China in a very short period or in a capsule form. And if we keep taking capsules for our own health, perhaps we will become healthier against China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to invite Abhishek Srivastav ji, but I think Gopal Pariyar ji wants to say something. So kindly take 1 minute, sir, please. Gopal ji.
Yeah, very, very small. Thank you, sir. Firstly, formal thanks will be given my other colleagues and moderators. I have only one query regarding some robot army. I've just seen a report on Beyond. Certainly, it's related with the futuristic point of view. I mean, how much India is prepared for that.
I think we are getting there. Again, we are doing multiple things. I draw your attention to someone mentioned my interview with Lieutenant General Raj Shukla, the Army Commander of the Army Training Command, who mentioned several things in the technology field that Indian military is doing, private sector is doing, and the industry and the academia is doing. So we are not very far behind. It's just that we tend to downplay our own achievements and our own strengths and our own capabilities. So I am not worried about it. Please don't give too much credence to the Chinese. The Chinese are not 10 feet tall. They are as short as we are, and therefore let's not fear them. Let's remove that fear in our minds about the Chinese. Thank you, Gopal.
Thank you, sir. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Abhishek Srivastav ji to give concluding remarks and propose vote of thanks. Dr. Abhishek Srivastav ji.
Thank you, Pranav ji. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to conclude a session on India and China. And it is also important to mention that to summing up a speech of one of the finest India's strategic thinker, Sri Nitin Gokhale ji, is not an easy task, sir. As Nitin ji has said, that between India and China, many disputes are open and it is in ongoing process. And New Delhi and Beijing never had a smooth relationship, but a hostile one. From border to economy and from bilateral engagement to multilateral forum, most of the time, balance of interest has always been a major issue for India. You have rightly pointed out, sir, the problem with Chinese attitude is that they don't believe in existing world order. Rather, they are trying to create an alternate one. On economic front, the unaccounted policies of our previous government has damaged largely to the Indian businesses. And if we see in a bigger picture, it created bigger security threat to India. I want to mention that I remember, I remember here, much before 1962 war, the RSS leader was speaking about the expansionist tendencies of communist China. In 1951, then RSS chief MS Golwalkar issued a statement at Simoga and highlighting the possible Chinese aggression on Bharat Bhumi. We ignored, our Prime Minister ignored this warning. So in present time, the Chinese, moreover, can also sense the shift in India's approach to China from Nehruvian idealism. That I love your words, the rosy and romantic Nehruvian idealism in early post-independence era to a new pragmatism. I subscribe this idea from one of my friends. In past few years, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi leadership, the shift also indicates the two different narratives about India's role and place in global affairs. From the earlier desire for Asian nationalism, what you have also mentioned, sir, the pan-Asian narratives, the Asian nationalism and non-alignment state to a more aspirational power boosted by the idea of cultural nationalism and comprehensive strategic thinking. So now I put my all gratitude in words on behalf of Pragyanam JNU. I'd like to thank Sri Nitin Gokhale, sir, for taking his time out and consenting to join our webinar in spite of his busy schedule. Sir, indeed, your words have enlightened us. Thank you, sir, for your words of wisdom.
Thank you.
We are also, sir, sir, I also want to mention we are also eagerly waiting for your upcoming book. I also request you to come again for book discussion in JNU, obviously after this Wuhan virus and in the physical mode. I also thank.
Certainly, I'll do that. The book is about actually, we have selected 12, just to give you information, not selling my book, but just saying that this is about, we have selected about 12 various operations of the RNAW, which secured India in different forms over the years. So that is the thing. And then one thing I'll pitch for is please do subscribe in larger numbers to our channels, Strat News Global and bharatshakti.in on YouTube, because we are a very small startup, but we try to survive through friends and our admirers' support and friends like you, newly made friends. Hopefully, you all will also support us in going forward. But I'm always there, available whenever required. Sorry to interrupt in this kind of a thing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. I also thank Dr. Ran Vijay for introductory remarks and organizer for this webinar for calibrating such thoughtful talk. And I would also like to thank all the respected participants for showing their interest in this webinar. I once again thank you everyone for making this seminar successful. Thank you, Pranavji, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Abhishek ji. Now, as usual, before departing, let us join our palms together and pray for peace within and without. Om Shanti, 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 Sabka Kalyan. Dhanyavad.
Thank you.